Bangkok. So just a housekeeping matter. For those who would like to listen to the translation, please go to the Thai room. And for those who would like to listen in English, please go to the English room. You will see a button at the bottom of the screen. This kind of the globe, the world, yeah, you see the world sign and interpretation. Just click there and then choose either English or Thai. And if you are able to listen to both languages, just go to the off channel. ห้องข้างล่างนะคะจะมีรูปลูกโลกนะคะแล้วก็มีคำว่า interpretation อยู่ข้างล่างเลือกห้องภาษาไทยนะคะถ้าต้องการฟังภาษาไทยถ้าฟังได้ทั้งสองภาษาก็อยู่ในห้องที่เขียนว่า off นะคะไม่ต้องไปที่ห้องอื่นนะคะ So we are very excited today. We have a lot of people, more than 200 people who have registered with us to join this Zoom meeting, and also for people who there are will be many more people who join the Facebook Live. So yeah, it's a very exciting time today. So I would like to start by going through the program so that everybody knows what will happen in the next 1.5 hours. So we will start with the opening remarks by Kun Debmark, the Assistant Cultural Attaché from the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok. And after that, we will have a presentation by our speaker, Professor John Paul Lederach. And then after that, we will have a reflection from scholars who have been working in Southern Thailand for more than a decade. Dr.Norbert Ropers, the directors of the Peace Resort Collaborative and senior advisor of the Berghof Foundation. Then after that, we will have a Q&A for about 20 minutes, and then this event will be concluded by a remark by Dr. Sompop Jitpiromsi, the director of the Center for Conflict Studies and Cultural Diversity. Just for housekeeping matter, I'm not sure if the host can mute everyone so that we won't get the noise from that's interrupting the event. All right, without further ado, we will begin the program by inviting Kun Debmark, the Assistant Cultural Attaché from the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok, to give an opening remark. Deb, the floor is yours.
Sawadee everyone, and good evening. My name is Deb Mack, and I am an Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer with the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok. The Embassy is very pleased to partner with the Institute for Peace Studies at Prince of Songkla University today to bring you this program on peace and conflict issues in Thailand and Southeast Asia. We are honored to welcome Professor Emeritus John Paul Lederach from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Many of you, based on tonight's numbers, I'm sure are familiar with his work, and we know he will bring excellent insight into current issues and challenges in the field of peace and conflict studies. I am sure you will all gain a lot from this presentation and the conversation that will follow. I would like to thank our partners in this program, Dr. Busabong Charoenwatana, Director of the Institute for Peace Studies, Prince of Songkla University, Dr. Sir Sompop Jitpiromsi, Director of CSCD and Chairperson of the Master Program in Conflict and Peace Studies, and finally, Dr. Norbert Ropers, Director of Peace Resources, Collaborative and Senior Advisor of the Berghof Foundation. I would also like to thank our moderator this evening, Dr. Rungravi Chalerm Sri Pinyorat, a lecturer at Institute for Peace Studies for Prince of Songkla University, who is acting as our host this evening. Thank you again for joining us all, and thank you for all of your support. Sawadee-ka.
สวัสดีค่ะขอบคุณมากค่ะคุณเจฟOkay, next, it is our tremendous honor and pleasure to welcome one of the world's most influential scholars of peace study, Professor John Paul Lederach. I would like to give a brief introduction of our guest tonight. Professor Lederach is a professor emeritus of international peacebuilding at John Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, Notre Dame University. He has been widely known for his pioneering work in conflict transformation. Professor Lederach has been involved in reconciliation work in Colombia, Northern Ireland, the Philippines, Nepal, as well as countries in East and West Africa. He has written 22 books and have conducted trainings programs in more than 25 countries. One of his most influential books, The Moral Imagination, The Arts and Soul of Building Peace, has been translated into Thai by the Institute for Human Rights and Peace Studies at Mahidol University. The book's title in Thai is พลังธรรมแห่งจินตนาการศิลปะและวิญญาณการสร้างสันติภาพ I think many people who join the event today have a chance to read his book. His work has been influential among peace builders in southern Thailand. His concept of pyramid of peace building and other concept has been used as a theoretical foundation by many peace builders in this region. Most notably is the decade-long project to create and nurture the Insider Peace Building platform, of which IPS has been one of the partners in this initiative. And tonight we will have Dr.Norbert Ropers, who is one of the most the key architect of this initiative, will join us tonight to share his reflection on the talk today. This project serves as a platform where various civil society groups such as Islamic leaders, local leaders, business people, Buddhist group, Buddhist monk, Malay Muslim activists, women and youth group, as well as government officials, military officers have come together to discuss and share their idea on various issues related to peace building in the Deep South. The so-called three-track of peace building has become popularized in the region. So if you talk to civil society in the Deep South and you talk about the track 1, track 2, and track 3, this is not an alien concept. They are, very familiar with this concept. So this stands as a testament to the important influence of Professor Lederach's work on peace building effort in Thailand as well as in other parts of the world. So today we are very privileged to have Professor Lederach who will speak with us tonight on the topic of the challenges of peace and conflict situation in Thailand and Southeast Asia. So without further ado, Professor Lederach, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and Sawadee Kap to all of you in Thailand. I wish I was there in person. It's been a long time since we have been able to travel. I see some familiar names and faces, so greetings to all of you. It's good to spend this time. My time this morning, so it's dark in my room, but that's because it's early morning. And I am privileged to have been offered this opportunity to be with you. In conversation with the organizers some months back, I have been thinking that the best approach to this next 30 minutes or so of opening our conversation, it might be useful to revisit the evolution of some of my own thinking, which can be found by watching the development of, over time, the books and the writing that I have been involved in. In particular, the book that I originally wrote starting in the late 1980s that came into publication in the mid 1990s was titled Building Peace, Sustainable Reconciliation in Divided Societies, which was published by the U.S. Institute of Peace at that time. 10 to 12 years later, I wrote the book, The Moral Imagination, that has been, as was noted, translated into Thai. The movement between these two books captured one of the things that I have found to be most enduring within the wider discussions and debates about how best to approach peace building when working on situations in particular that would be similar to what Thailand and in the south of Thailand is being faced and has been faced for quite a few years. And I thought it might be useful to take one of those pieces of evolution in my own thinking and break it out a bit more into some of the key learnings or insights that I have been carrying and continuing to think about over these years. And that is the discussion, or if you will, the debate that exists between the differences of what is often referenced as top-down approaches to peace building compared with bottom-up approaches to peace building. The reference that was just made around the three-track approach in that early book, Building Peace, the pyramid scheme that I think many of you are familiar with descriptively tried to identify three different levels of activities and theories of change that were happening simultaneously, quite often within these settings of deep division. That second tier was referenced in that book as the middle out approach. By the time I wrote the book, The Moral Imagination, I was shifting my language to the web approach. So top down and bottom up was complemented with the notion of what I referenced as the web approach. Since that time, which would roughly be in the mid 2000s to now, about 20 years later, I am still working through understanding how significant a shift it was to begin to look at what I referenced as a web approach based on the study, primarily, as you know from the book, the actual study of how spiders make webs and how webs visually capture some very interesting aspects of the challenges that we face when approaching the challenges of really deep and protracted conflict. So I thought I would share 5 points of observation or reflection around this notion of the web approach, and then would invite, certainly I know our good friend Norbert Ropers and others of you may be bringing forward some comments that would contextualize what it is that you're looking at within a given context in Thailand, but also the question and answer period would afford us opportunity to see where you're thinking and where your questions are going. The first point that I would make about the web approach is that I think that it takes much more of a systems orientation, a systems lens, understanding, if you will, how to take a step back and envision the whole of the context and the evolution of the conflict in context, not only over time, but in reference to its complexity. This system lens is partially oriented toward what I early on referred to as a more comprehensive view, but it did look very specifically at some shifts in understanding. One of those was the shift in how we understood, if you will, space. Spiders, if I follow them closely, are geniuses around the challenge of how best to cover a space in order to achieve a purpose. And in the ways that I understood the language of those scientists who study web making, they often identified the notion of anchor points. So anchor points were key strategic locations within a space, but that were often the furthest apart. So that the early threads of a web are laid connecting to the key anchor points within a situation, within a context. And they crisscross at a hub, a second concept, hubs and nodes, the crisscrossing of the threads. But there is embedded within that then the strengthening of a web by way of circular motion and the movement from the center to the periphery. Now, all of these concepts I will try to come back to, but my first point is that a web approach takes a step back and tries to understand the bigger picture. What is the bigger picture that we're living in, both in terms of space and time? In terms of space, a systems orientation is not as concerned as perhaps the central aspects of quite often what's involved in the perspectives of negotiation and conflict resolution, more narrow, if you will, approaches that often look at this in terms of geography and in terms of stakeholders, which is a concept that's quite often used within the parameters of those approaches. A web approach will understand space as the landscape of interactive dynamics. It's looking at how repeated patterns over time have capacity to replicate themselves independent of the change of people and independent even of the change of day-to-day issues that may be present at any given moment. So how to understand that web of interactive dynamics is what is really being explored with that lens in reference to space. With reference to time, the key aspect that emerges is the challenge of how to combine short-term crises and response with long-term and more strategic change. We do not have the luxury of either living on one end or the other of that time challenge. If we only live in the crisis, we become like the firemen who are dashing from one fire to the next, and often without a sense of the bigger picture of what is producing this replication of fires. If we live only in the long term, we are often irrelevant to people's day-to-day needs and demands. As they say quite often, especially on the African continent, it's good to talk of peace, but we can't eat peace. We need food today. We need rice on the table. We need a lowering of the level of violence. We need things that are immediate. And so how to combine the short and the long term remains one of the biggest challenges. My specific understanding from the web approach was that it was both and. You have to find ways of being short-term responsive and long-term strategic. And to combine those creates a way in which you begin to unfold a process of change that does not exclude those two, but understands their interdependence and their connection. The specific point, which was well articulated, I think, even in the introduction today, and the work that many of you have been involved in, is to shift more toward decade thinking, to understand the unfolding of the day-to-day decisions within a wider parameter of time around the change that is being explored. This leads to my second point, which is the word interdependence. A web approach will always have a very keen understanding of the interdependencies that exist within any given situation. I think the core shift that comes from this perspective is basically the shift from looking at conflict with reference to cause and causal orientation and understanding it more in reference to connections, from cause to connections. Now, what do we mean by that with reference to interdependency? It is early on in my career and work, all the way through till now, which has been the better part now of 4+ decades, I firmly believe that ultimately building peace is very much about a relationship-centric understanding of social change. That ultimately it is not the quantity of our activity or the quantity of what we bring to a particular situation. It is about the quality of our relationships that determine the core of what's evolving and what's happening. But we end up focusing an enormous amount of time into the content and the arguments of a particular moment or situation. And we lose sight of the relational aspect where the dynamics over time are often embedded. So to understand interdependence is to take a relationship-oriented approach to social change, but it is also about understanding that it's not looking for the magic formula, a kind of if we could find the cause, we could change the problem and the outcome. When we start to do that, we actually narrow complexity down to a singular aspect. And what I have found is that the shift from the web orientation, the shift from causal to connections, is that at any given moment, there are a multiplicity of people at a multiplicity of locations and levels of society who are engaged in a multiplicity of activity and action. Now, when I emphasize this word multiplicity, this actually brings us closer to the understanding of complexity. That at any given moment, we are embedded in a web of complex interactions. And it takes an understanding of the interdependency to know that while we may have access to a particular aspect, issue, moment, or location, that ultimately is connected to a range of other things and necessarily brings forward at least a small dose, if not a big dose, of humility. And the arguments that we often find ourselves wrapped up in are arguments about whose engagement matters more. What is the core key that makes everything else tick? And those I have found to often be formulas for misunderstanding the ultimate interdependence we have on finding a way to look at this wider web of activity and engagement, and to remain curious and open to those things that we do not have access to, but that we understand impact what we do have access to. So interdependency, I think, is really a key aspect of recognizing that we need multiple sets of people and activities, and we need what the spider would call the nodes of connection that crisscross those in interesting and creative ways. This leads to a third point, which has often been a part of the language of the field of peace studies that many of you from the university settings would be quite familiar with, which is the challenge of how to work, and here I'll use two different ways of describing it, One approach has described this as what are the connections between the center and the periphery? Now, when people use the language of center and periphery, they're often talking about geographically speaking, in many of the countries that experience internal, protracted, long-term violent conflict, they're often talking about capital and large city locations and locations that are more in rural areas. That, for example, would be a big conversation in the country of Colombia. It may also be experienced in Thailand as the difference between Bangkok and other parts of the country and how those vary. It also is, by using center and periphery, is often talking about elite power control and marginalized communities or marginalized minority groups. There are a wide variety of ways that this may be expressed, and those cut across identities, whether they are by religion, by linguistic backgrounds, by geographic location, by race. There's a whole range. And of course, the issues around center and periphery often have very much to do with economics and class-related issues around who has access to and who does not have access to the basic resources for a dignified life and livelihood. This also is often applied as a way to understand politics. The center being who has control, who has more dominant control of political decisions and decision making, and who has been marginalized or has not had that same level of access. So that's one of the languages that's used, which is how do you connect center and periphery? The second one, the one that I worked with, especially in the book Building Peace, and have subsequently over these decades continued to believe is perhaps the most significant gap in peace building, is the connection between the vertical and horizontal relationships. Now, by vertical and horizontal, I was trying to reference two different ways of understanding how both conflict and peace building happen. Horizontal relationships or horizontal connections are essentially about ways in which people connect with each other across the divisions that may exist within any given society. So whether that's by religion or, like I said earlier, potentially race or linguistics, the languages that people speak, the divisions become points of identity. And people have an us and them understanding of the conflict. And a horizontal understanding is who creates the bridging and the crisscrossing across those lines of division. Now, typically, that happens when we look at it as clearly as we can at a descriptive way that peace building is often thought about. It often has that notion of the higher or the top and the grassroots. So that quite often peace building will look at horizontal work at a local community. We'll be asking a local community or a region, how are they engaged with relationships that have been divisive where they live? If it's politically, it's often crisscrossing horizontally across the divisions that may exist by those who have access to significant levels of representation or power. Now, the reason I make that emphasis is that we have been faced for quite some time with a challenge that I once referred to as the vertical gap, the most significant gap in peace building, at least in my estimation. The vertical gap has a very different orientation. The vertical orientation is asking the question, how do those who sit at the high end of representation of the wider population connect with those who are often on the ground experiencing the direct day-to-day impact of much of this conflict? In other words, how does the grassroots, how does the local level connect with the higher level within any given society? And I think that the vertical relationships, the vertical, have been the weakest component of much of peace building. And in fact, we may have, and I have participated in this, we may have inadvertently chosen the wrong image or metaphor when we use the word track. Let me explain why I think that may be the case. Tracks was originally something like a pathway, or more specifically, best image of tracks would be something like the train tracks, you know, of a moving train that is moving parallel in a direction. Why might this be an image that challenges us? It is precisely because there are not many connections between the two tracks. They move in time parallel, but they don't have the same esteem, esteem meaning they don't value each other in the same way, and they don't have many points where they meet. And the challenge quite often has been both a question of recognition and acknowledgement that the other levels of activity are significant, often replaced by levels of critique that what they are doing is getting in the way of what we are doing. That's something I have found to be rather consistently true, whether you're looking from the bottom up or the top down. But it's also true that beyond the recognition and acknowledgement, we simply have been less than creative around how we bring these together in ways that they become integrated. And I think the challenge has been for peace building is built around the word integration. How do you work toward vertical and horizontal integration? Where do they meet and create a synergy that has a transformative quality for the whole of the population? Now, it may well be that part of this was due to the fact that as you move upwards in the metaphoric understanding of moving toward the top level, those that are more visible but fewer in number, you often are reliant on some form of representation. And representation builds around a notion that a few will be able to speak for the many. Yet the greatest single complaint that I have heard across 40 years is that what the few are speaking does not fully represent what we are experiencing. And that means that we have gaps that the representational model has not fully been able to understand or to design in innovative ways how to approach it. I think that for the most part, this remains one of the biggest challenges, and it would be interesting to hear your experience over these the last decade or so in Thailand around this notion of how does local connect with higher levels of what is happening within any given setting. The web approach, and here I'll go to my fourth point. So my third point was basically that we need to find greater understanding of integration, a greater understanding of mutual recognition and synergy. The fourth point would be that the web approach actually can look more carefully at the movement of the spider when the web is being constructed and repaired. And the movement more than the product. So when I talk about a web, you may have an image, and in fact, I think on this call tonight, there may be a few of you that have been with me when we have gone into the forest to find spider webs and have looked very carefully at how an actual spider web functions. When you see a spider web, you see the thing, the product. What you may not notice is the movement that created it. And if we place the emphasis on the movement that created it, it actually is quite illustrative of things that we may need to do more creatively within the wider field of peace building. The spider movements are essentially 3 or 4. The first is the ability to go to and connect to the furthest anchor points in any setting. Those are actually the first points of contact. The movement out to the furthest points of location that crisscross at an early hub. The second movement is very much the movement of circulation, moving around. So based on the early long strands and threads, there then is a strengthening that comes from the circling. The third movement is that is also a movement that is, in the technical term, like radii. Now, radii is what moves from the center out, like a spoke in a bicycle. You know, the hub of a bicycle and the spoke that goes out to the rim of the bicycle. And so that movement of circulating starts sometimes in the middle, but then we'll move to the far edges, and we'll actually take time to stitch the edges together. And then we'll come back and begin to fill in. So there's movement from center out and back. There's movement around. There is movement to the farthest points. There is movement to create, in the view of the spider, the strength of a web is always reliant on 2 things. The first is flexibility. The strands of silk are done in a way that those that need to last the longest have the greatest give and take, so that they can be hit, they give, and they come back to purpose. Very significant that rigidity, like a steel knife, is not the concept of strength. The concept of strength is the ability to be hit and come back. The second is that every part of the web is capable of functioning independent of whether other parts of the web do. Now, this is the reason why there are so many crisscrossing nodes, because the concept is that over time, the web will be hit. And it will be hit by the wind, it will be hit by the rain, it will be hit by the animals, it will be hit by whatever, so that if one part of the web is hit and destroyed, the others continue in time, which is a concept of prevention as strength, preparation as strength, independence and interdependence, not one over the other. Interdependent in the whole, independent in that each part has its own strength and capacity to rebound when it's done. And the third concept, which is very common to web making for the spider, is that repair is permanent. Repair is permanent. There is a permanent process of repairing the parts of the web that have been hurt. That also adds a third element of strength. Now, why do I say this? In part because I think the movement and the mental model of that web making is very much about how circulation, moving in the space constantly over time, has an ability to stitch things that centralization does not have. So it's a movement from centralized control, centralization, to circulation. In some regards, for peace building in particular, it's a movement from convening to circulation. We often think about the work of peace building as convening people into a space to talk. That is, bringing people into a particular location who are coming from different angles. There's a certain power in that we don't fully are not always fully cognizant of. The actual model of the spider is not convening, but circulating. And behind that is actually a theory of social change. That circulation permits the process of gathering and dropping, gathering and dropping, gathering and dropping, which is referred to by those who study insects as stigmergy. Stigmergy being leaving a scent, a smell in the landscape is the way that common purpose can be achieved without centralized control. That was called by entomologists, people who study insects, that was called the paradox of coordination. How do whole collectives achieve common purpose without centralized control? Now, that may sound odd, but I actually think when we review much of the history of how peace building happens, we pay too much attention to the events of convening and too little attention to the quality of our circulation. Now, COVID has made this particularly challenging because we aren't able to quite travel in the same way, though I have noticed that these virtual meetings have made a different form of circulation more possible. I doubt that I would be with you right now, at 5:30 in the morning, my time, if it were not possible for this particular form of circulation. And we are circulating here. We are dropping ideas and you are picking them up, and then you're going to add your idea, and then others will pick it up. And that dropping and gathering is actually what leaves the threads. And as those threads cohere, they begin to create a web of a wider consensus of what might be possible. I think this is particularly important for a reason that we have not fully understood. So I'll leave this as the last comment on point 4. And that is the need to develop a greater capacity for collective empathy. We place a lot of emphasis in our field on empathy, but primarily as individuated empathy. There's a long phrase that dates back into some of the indigenous traditions about walking a mile, walking a kilometer in the shoes of another, to understand what a particular person's experience and story has been. That form of empathy we often work with. When we circulate, if 2 or 3 of us go together to sit and listen to a local community, we are looking at the world from the experience of that community. And what begins to emerge is a collective empathy, not just an individuated empathy. And I think that the movement of circulation actually creates greater opportunity for people to understand how the world has been seen and experienced from the places where it has been lived. And when we move away from that lived experience, we disembody the deeper understanding of what it is that is happening and the meaning that people are bringing to the situations that they have traversed and lived. So circulating in part makes possible a deeper collective empathy around the complexity of what has been lived, which I think is a key ingredient to the wider process of social change. My final point, and here I will end because I've taken probably more time than I should. Much of what I have described around this web approach assumes 2 or 3 key ways of choosing to be in the world. So much of peace building is placed on the skills and the activities, and too little attention, I think, is placed on the qualities of our presence, the qualities of who we are choosing to be. So I will note here 3. The first is that it is impossible to use a web approach unless you have a deep sense of humility, that you are a small part of something that's much bigger. That sense of humility is what is needed to open up the capacity for sustained curiosity. That is to stay open to those things that are not fully known. So the question becomes, how do we nurture, how do we encourage humility and curiosity? The second is, none of this is going to happen quickly. The question becomes, how do we persevere? How do we keep going when things feel like they have not moved fast or well? And this, I believe, is very much about the challenge of understanding peace building as requiring of us a perseverance over time and a sense of keeping at it that is not always fully brought forward when we are discussing the recipes, the formulas, and the strategies that if you just knew this, everything else would be okay. And then the deep loss of hope and despair that can come. So how to persevere is also about how to keep hope very vibrant. The third one is the connection between patience and creativity. Within this, I think we will need a great deal of patience, but patience should be understood as going hand in hand with the capacity to constantly innovate and recreate new opportunities. The ability to understand our work as artists, not just technicians, I think is a deeply significant one. So how do we embed within our processes and within our capacities of people who are interested in this kind of vocational engagement? How do we embed the patience and the creativity that will be needed over time? I say this because these are the qualities that often don't enter the mainstream of the preparation or the academic or the scholarly work, but I have found them consistently to be the things that are missing when processes do not go well, and that will be needed if they are to continue to recreate and re-innovate over and again, facing the challenges that will come day to day. I will stop there and thank you again very much for this opportunity. I look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Lederach, for the very thought-provoking talk. It is interesting to hear the shift in your thinking over time from the track and pyramid scheme of peace building to what you call the web approach. Now, I think there is no better person to give a reflection on his talk than Dr. Norbert Ropers. He is a scholar practitioner who has worked enthusiastically, patiently, and humbly with various civil society and social groups in southern Thailand for more than a decade. He is a key person behind the creation of the Insider Peace Building platform. So Norbert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
That is excellent. Professor Lederach, I was very impressed by your presentation, and I was very happy when you started with the web and with the reference to the systemic look at peace processes and how one can nurture and in future development more systematically and more deeply. You have presented in your 5 elaborations, a very fascinating overview of how a deep understanding of the web can help us to see more the details of what drives conflicts and how to transform them, and to be more patient, to be more careful, to focus more on aspects which are not immediately visible, but who, like in the web, are crucial to achieve what the animals in the web can achieve. I would like to, well, no, first I should say, you presented to us so many interesting ideas, proposals, and perspectives, which I would like to study in future more in detail. Following your presentation, I was particularly attracted by aspects from whom I learned that they played a key role in working in the deep south of Thailand and trying to transform that conflict. And when I use your tools, which the 5 tools you just summarized, I identified right at the beginning one element which one of my colleagues working in the Deep South mentioned a couple of years ago as one of the most important issues, that we should not look at the conflict in the Deep South of Thailand as a special case which only affects the people in that particular region. She was the one who empowered our team by saying we have to expand the engagement not only with respect to the people who are close to the Malay Muslims in the South. We have to look at the whole system. We have to look at Thailand as the entity which has created this conflict and whose involvement will also be necessary for transforming it. And that gave us a much bigger picture when we, in the last 2-3 years, try to translate that in our practical work, that we not only focused on the situation in the Deep South in the narrow sense, but we also looked at the whole system of Thailand, and particularly at those activists and people who were not very happy about the situation in the country and who started to engage in new forms of questioning the traditional elite about their concept how to bring forward the country of Thailand. I don't want to go into all the details of the 5 categories you put into the center, but I would like, with respect to the first point you made, what is the bigger picture? I think that is a very good formulation for us, what we have learned while doing our work in the Deep South, to look at the bigger picture. And the last couple of years, we have very much focused on people who are working outside of the center. Now, with respect to the second point you mentioned, the causal connections. It was very interesting when we tried to understand what are the main drivers of the conflict. We realized that too much focus was focused on the military aspect of the conflict instead of having a much more holistic perspective of that conflict to understand where are the drivers of this conflict. The point number 3, I personally is something which also in a way in the past couple of years sometimes confused me. How should we define the vertical and the horizontal level, and how can we connect them with each other? I think the way how you have analyzed it and emphasized the weaknesses in the classical way how vertical and horizontal engagements are dealt with can become a very helpful tool in the future. Concerning the 4th point, the movement of the spider, it immediately reminded me when I'm thinking of the very small group of people who work in our team. We are right now only 7 people, before we were 9 people. And we were wondering, so how can we amplify and do more for the dissemination of our type of work? And when you mentioned this aspect of the movement of the spider, I immediately had to think of also some special groups we identified as particularly very influential groups for the transmission of the situation in the Deep South. And I think personally that this approach of in which direction do we move, what can help us to win new insights. I would like to illustrate that with respect to a group of Buddhist activists in the Deep South of Thailand who have formed an organization based at the very beginning on the understanding we have to work together to defend ourselves against the majority community of the Malay Muslims in the Deep South. And we had a first in-depth meeting with representatives of this movement, and we learned in that context that while several of them have a very skeptical perspective of any chances of collaborating with the other side of the identity groups in that region, we also learned that there are some among them who have by now learned that without engaging in detail with the identity groups who now form the majority in the Deep South of the country, there will be no settlement of the conflict possible. I have to confess, the 5th point, I have no idea that I can immediately relate to what you presented to us. Instead, I would like to use the remaining time I have to share with all of you and also your effort to bring this concept closer to us. I think what is happening right now, it's very important because last week the Thai government and the resistance movement had a 2 days meeting with each other, how they would like to shape and organize the future collaboration with each other. And if I look at the plans they have put together, having 3 groups focused on different issues, if I compare that picture with the multiplicity of the web, I think what is now the starting point for addressing the conflict in a more creative new way, it is useful maybe to inspire the 2 parties who are involved in this process also to bring them together with the concept of the web, because that will allow many more in-depth perspectives which otherwise will not come to the foresight. And I think it will not be enough only to have 3 working groups and from time to time some people from the local level to learn about what the 2 groups have developed as proposals for the future. I think it will be necessary not only on the top level and on the level of the local population to have some meetings with the participation of 20 or 30 people. We need a much more fundamental review of the approach with the help of the cyber web, because so many more people and so many activists who have spent already for several years their interest and their proposals, they have to be brought into the system. So to put it in one conclusion, I feel inspired by your website to develop some new ideas and proposals and to present them to the Thai state as well as to the resistance movement, to learn about in a much more complex way about intelligent ways to transform the conflict. I hope I will have in future more in-depth opportunities to study what you had to present here within half an hour. I would like to learn much more about it, but now I think my time is coming to an end, and I would like to thank you for the attention. And now in the next round, we have more opportunity to discuss one or the other aspect you have presented, John.
Thank you very much, Norbert.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Norbert, for illuminating this concept of spiderweb by using your rich experiences on the ground working with various social groups in the Deep South. So next, it will be a Q&A session. So I will switch back into Thai to make it easier for the audience. ช่วงต่อไปนะคะก็จะเป็นการถามตอบนะคะก็สามารถที่จะถามคำถามเป็นภาษาไทยหรือถ้าถนัดภาษาอังกฤษก็ถามเป็นภาษาอังกฤษได้เลยนะคะก็ล่ามก็จะทำหน้าที่แปลให้กับอาจารย์ Lederach นะคะก็มีเวลาประมาณสัก15นาทีก็จะรับคำถามทั้งเปิดไมค์แล้วก็ในแชทนะคะอาจารย์ธรรมศาสตร์อาจารย์ปอจะเป็นคนช่วยอ่านคำถามในแชทนะคะถ้าเกิดว่าใครที่อยากจะ ถามแบบพูดนะคะก็กดยกมือนะคะแล้วก็จะเรียกตามลำดับนะคะขอให้แนะนำตัวสั้นๆด้วยก่อนที่จะถามคำถามขอบคุณมากค่ะมีคำถามนะคะมีคำถามในแชทอยู่อันนึงนะคะของอาจารย์ศรีดา
ค่ะมีคำถามอยู่จากสองคนนะคะงั้นจะขออนุญาตอ่านนะคะจากในแชทคำถามชุดแรกนะคะอย่างที่อาจารย์ว่าคือเราคิดแต่เรื่องแทร็กแต่ไม่สามารถสร้างความสัมพันธ์อะไรได้เลยกรณีจังหวัดชายแดนภาคใต้แม้จะมีคณะพูดคุยคณะเจรจาสันติภาพซึ่งเป็นกระบวนการพูดคุยในระดับคนในระดับสูงนะคะแต่ก็ยังมีการปรับปรามโดยใช้ความรุนแรงกับคนรากหญ้ากลุ่มชาติพันธุ์อยู่ตลอดเวลาโดยฝ่ายทหารฝ่ายพูดคุยก็อ้างว่าการพูดคุยไม่เกี่ยวกับการใช้กำลังปราบปรามนะคะคำถามซึ่งมันก็ได้สร้างความโกรธแค้นของผู้คนในพื้นที่นะคะแล้วก็เป็นการแบ่งแยกมวลชนเป็นฝักเป็นฝ่ายด้วยซึ่งถ้าสถานการณ์ยังเป็นลักษณะนี้การพูดคุยสันติภาพที่สงวนให้กับการใช้ความรุนแรงกับประชาชนจะทำให้เกิดสันติภาพได้จริงหรือไม่นี่คือคำถามแรกนะคะคำถามที่2ประชาชนควรจะทำอย่างไรเมื่อรัฐบาลพยายามเสแสร้งให้เห็นว่าตัวเองมีเอกภาพในรัฐบาลเองแต่ไม่สามารถสร้างสันติภาพได้จริงชุดนี้มี2คำถามค่ะอ่านต่อเลยไหมคะ
Professor Ledward, would you like to get like a few questions and answer at one go, or do you want to go one by one?
I'm not sure if you were asking me. I would prefer to hear the questions since I've talked a good bit. It might be good to hear what people are thinking and maybe adding in. I see a number of hands that are up too.
Yes, yeah, because with the shortage of time, maybe we get a few questions, maybe 2 more questions from Ajahn Shayanit and Ajahn Chaiwat, and then we can hear from Professor Ledward.
Should I go first or should I give the floor to Ajahn Chaiwat first?
ไม่รู้ใครยกมือก่อนค่ะ
Go first then.
Okay.
Hi, Professor Lederach. Chayanit Punyarat from Faculty of Political Science, Thammasat University, and a former student of Professor Lederach. It's very nice seeing you again. Well, I'm particularly interested in your very last point. You sort of mentioned the quality that we sort of bring to peace building, and you also mentioned at the very beginning that you yourself have been doing this for over 4 decades. So I don't know if you could maybe share some of your own insights of how you yourself maintain humility. You know, you're world-renowned scholars, everybody know you, and how do you remain your humility, curiosity, because you've written 20 books and you seem to know a great deal. And especially, I think, I'm very interested in how do you remain creativity. And I guess my most important curiosity is on hope. You've been doing this for a long time. How do you yourself, you've seen atrocity, injustice, oppression here and there. How do you yourself maintain hope? And with your sharing, I think we could learn a great deal and hopefully trying to, follow your footsteps. Thank you very much.
ค่ะเรียนเชิญอาจารย์ชัยวัฒน์สถานันท์ค่ะ
Hi, John Paul. Has been a while. Good to see you. I did not know that you would come to us with the web, and I, as a good fan of The Amazing Spider-Man, I think I have to say something about it. I have 4 points very quickly. The first one, do you know, John Paul, that spider is a special animal in Islam because of its role in protecting the Prophet. And so if there is anything that is a status of a special animal in Islam, it's the spider. When the Prophet was fleeing the Mecca on his way to Medina, he hid in the cave. and then God sent the spider, and the spider, spread their web around the cave, and so the Neka, the Quraysh, who came after him, then fled as a result. So the spider is very significant in the context of the Muslim society. The second point is that I'm very fascinated by the metaphor you use about the web, so I will take it further theoretically. So many points, but the one that caught me is about building peace as a relationship-centric social change that you were talking about. Now, but if you imagine relationship as bridges, I wonder, in your years of experience, are there bridges that we need to take down, as well as bridges that we need to construct and sustain? Because not all bridges are the same. And some of the bridges and some of the relationship could be very toxic. So what constitutes the toxicity of this relationship? The third point is about the movement of the spider. I'm very much interested in the movement of the spider because, John Paul, the way the spider moves is because of its legs. The legs use hydraulic pressure of fluid and muscle to move, which is very unlike how we move. That's why it can do what it could. But the most fascinating thing you said is about the construction of collective empathy. Now, the notion of empathy in English is put someone into the other's shoes. Put yourself into my shoes. That's empathy in a way. But in Thai, it goes deeper than that. In Thai, the word for the meaning of empathy is เอาใจเขามาใส่ใจเรา meaning put your heart into mine. And it's far more difficult than to put myself into your shoes, which I cannot because your feet are so big, John Paul. And so to put the heart into the others is quite amazing. Is it possible to do?
โทษนะคะเสียงอาจารย์เบาลงไปหรือเปล่าคะ
How far can we do? Can you hear me?
ได้ยินแต่เบานิดนึงค่ะอาจารย์
Can you hear me?
ค่ะ
Yeah. My mic said that I should stop.
โอเคแล้วค่ะ โอเคแล้วค่ะอาจารย์ดังค่ะ
Okay. The last point is this. The last point is what is the purpose of this web? The purpose of the spider's web is to catch a prey. What is the prey of peace building, if there is any? Now that's all. Thank you. It's so much to hear you, John Paul, after all these years. Fascinating.
ขอบคุณอาจารย์ชัยวัฒน์มากนะคะอาจารย์มาทีไรก็มีความคิดดีๆให้เราคิดต่อตลอดนะคะก็ Professor Lederach, would you like to maybe give some reflection or answer some of the questions before we collect questions for another round?
Okay. Well, these are wonderful contributions, and thank you very much. And it is especially good to see Professor Chaiwat and Need, who I haven't seen for quite some time. So it's wonderful to see you and hear you. Some of these seem to relate back and forth, maybe starting with the very first one, just very briefly, that came from the chat. I think one of the biggest challenges, and that I certainly was trying to identify in the book, The Moral Imagination, is that people that I have observed that have been very creative in response to long-term and deep conflict rarely have the opportunity, in fact, never have the opportunity of making everything stop so they can figure out a good answer. They have to find a way to transcend and move beyond the violence while they're still living in it. So this is at the core of much of peace building, is that we have to find ways of creating the innovation while the patterns are still happening. And so it in reference to these challenges, it's precisely why, coming maybe forward to one or two of the observations that came in the second set of questions, it's one of the reasons why I felt that early in my career, so much emphasis was placed on, if you will, the technical aspect of the peace building. Learning somebody's particular analysis or particular strategy or particular technique, becoming a well-versed mediator, knowing what the rules were, knowing how you should, you know, what the strategy was. And what I found in so many of the places where deep innovation was happening, it often happened in local communities that were responding to situations that felt like they were overwhelming, but they innovated. They brought creativity and innovation to what they were doing. And I began to wonder, you know, I was perplexed, if you will, about how little interaction in my own preparation brought together the world of, if you will, of the arts, the artistic process, into the center aspects of peace building. And so from quite a ways back, I think if there are elements that I point to, I would not pretend that what I'm about to say is a good recipe for anyone. My advice to your question, Neve, would be, I think each person needs to find their own recipe. But I will share with you, you know, I write poetry every day. In the book, The Moral Imagination, you will see that I doodle. My father was the one who had the better hand in creating the doodles for the book, but rather than using a computer to generate very well honed technical graphics, I often just sit with people and draw pictures and arrows and ideas, and they're often done around informal conversation. During COVID, it's been more complex, but my experience has been that nothing is quite as good as sitting around tea or coffee, talking and drawing pictures on napkins. So I actually, in the book, I refer to them as napkin doodles. And they're just simple little ways to visualize what it is that we're hearing. I believe pretty deeply in walking. I think something happens when we engage with nature. So much of my everyday in small doses where I'm located, either I have two places that one is a bit more mountainous and one is a bit more desert-like. And in both locations, interaction with nature has a renewing capacity. Interaction with nature where you bring some form of slowing down enough to notice what's around you has an ability to refill the wells of patience and awe and appreciation and gratitude. I think that those are actually core elements that sustain hope. And hope is really not about something in the future. Hope is how we choose to make our step today. That's the change I would make around the word hope. Too often we think that what hope means is to wait until something in the future comes. I think hope is the way you choose to step today. And you show with your life what you believe is coming. And that's what I found always with people who, in spite of enormous odds and a lot of violence, kept choosing to respond in ways that were dignified for them. That is, that if you will, emboldened their own sense of worth and dignity, but did it in a way that refused to dehumanize another. And that to me is living hope, not waiting on, on it. And that's the shift that I think it makes it possible to go longer. Professor Chawat, I would love to have like 2 weeks with you to talk spiders, because I'm collecting new understandings at every step of the way. So for me, I had not fully realized, though it was very parallel, I had not fully realized that aspect in Islam. David Abrams wrote a wonderful book about the cave of webs, where an experience was watching how in a single evening, with the change in light, watching rainstorms from within a cave out, how the webs continued to appear. And that was kind of the impression that I had. But I think it's extraordinary. I'm sorry that the sound dropped just a little bit, and maybe you could repeat for me. The Thai concept of empathy was my heart into your heart. I couldn't quite, there was a point where the volume went down and I missed that piece of it, but it sounded very much parallel to what I was saying, though I'm particularly interested in how we understand the lived experience of whole communities, and not exclusively the lived experience of a single, which is important, but to place our capacity for empathy in the direction of how whole communities have experienced something, how it's seen from the patios and the streets of their cities and the patios of their homes. This, for me, I think, is one of the keys to how we shift toward a transformational notion. But I very much appreciate, I think the prey, you ask about what it is that the web of peace building is catching. I think it's found in those words that I just said. It's catching an ability to rehumanize and to bring dignity back to our relationships and to create a quality of life and livelihood that fundamentally recognizes our interdependency and our mutual need for each other. And that's what gets lost in violence, which is the ultimate form of dehumanization, because it takes the very vibration of life out. There is no more vibrating. And so it brings back the vibrancy of our shared humanity. And that's what I think we're trying to capture. And I would probably say, I think it's best done not in thinking about the spider as a single individual, but to actually understand what might be the form, I think what Norbert was saying, the form of kind of like spider teams that are a bit mixed. Small sets of people that circulate, who come from different eyes and ears, can make a massive difference in the way people feel seen and heard in other places and what is dropped and gathered. And that should be a permanent kind of a feature in many of these contexts, a constant circulation, as opposed to arriving to a single conversation. Singularity rarely will attend to the complexity that we have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lederach. ไม่แน่ใจว่าอาจารย์ชัยวัฒน์จะอธิบายสั้นๆไหมคะหรือยังไงดีคะมีอีก3มือเราอยู่
The word I use in Thai, John Paul, is เอาใจเขามาใส่ใจเรา meaning bring the other's heart into our own. That's what empathy means in Thai. Yes.
ขอบคุณมากค่ะ yeah, since you can see that we have enthusiastic audience today, we still have 3 hands and 1 more question in the chat. Professor Lederach, if you still have the energy, with your permission, we might extend the session for maybe another 15 minutes, if that is okay with you.
Yes, please come.
Thank you very much. ก็จะขออนุญาตให้ทั้ง3ท่านได้ถามในรอบเดียวกันเลยนะคะเพราะว่าเวลาค่อนข้างจำกัดแล้วก็เดี๋ยวจะอ่านคำถามในแชทนะคะแล้วให้อาจารย์Lederachได้ตอบทีเดียวค่ะเชิญอาจารย์ซีน่านะคะจากคณะเศรษฐศาสตร์ของมอ.ค่ะ
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful talk. My name is Sinatri Wanchai from Faculty of Economics, Prince of Songkhla University. I was a former student of Professor Chaiwat as well at Thammasat University. Sawadee krab Ajahn. I would like to ask about Deep South situation, but with your point of view. I have heard that Deep South conflicts, actually, if we look at a broader view, we will find that some interest groups actually think about conflicts as a rationale to achieve some other goals. For example, they say conflicts need to be maintained for military roles and budget, something like that. So what to do for peace building in this situation where some interest groups or some parties that think conflicts not to be resolved but to be maintained, while some others think about try to put their best to do the peace building. If you can give some brief analysis with your web approach. Thank you.
ขอบคุณค่ะอาจารย์ท่านต่อไปค่ะคุณแอนนาค่ะเสียงเบานิดนึงค่ะไม่ค่อยได้ยินค่ะไม่ทราบท่านอื่นได้ยินไหมคะ
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. My name is Anna Kristi Suwardi. I'm Indonesian actually, but I'm living and working here in Thailand. I'm actually also advisor of Ajahn Sisompop. Sawasdee Ajahn. I'm very glad and also grateful for the organizer to have Professor Lederach tonight with us, as I've been referring to his work most of the time in my master study. So Professor Lederach, I'm interested to know more about the interdependency concept that you have elaborated tonight in relation to how we use this approach when it comes to peace movement that actually coming from the grassroots and even minority groups. In this sense is let's, for example, women's groups, which we are now specifically in peace in the southern Thailand context. Most of the peace talk was, were excluded women. There was very least women who involved in the peace talk, and most of us also know very well that in terms of conflict, women's group are actually having double burdens in terms of the effect of the conflict. So I would like to listen from your perspective how we actually can utilize the interdependency in terms of how we can have more inclusiveness in a way that regardless the power of the groups who are involved in the peace movement can all together work to contribute toward the peace building. Thank you ขอบคุณมากค่ะสวัสดีค่ะ
ค่ะขอบคุณค่ะท่านต่อไปค่ะคุณรมฎอนปัญจอจาก Deep South Watch นะคะ
So Professor Lederach, please allow me to ask you in Thai ผมขอถามเป็นภาษาไทยนะครับคำถามเดียวครับคือฟังอาจารย์ abstract to abstract มากแล้วก็ให้เผยของอาจารย์อยู่แต่อยากถามอาจารย์คำถามเดียวครับอาจารย์เว็บ approach ของอาจารย์เนี่ยถ้าเราสนใจที่จะดูปฏิบัติการของมันที่สำเร็จเป็น best practice เป็นตัวอย่างที่ดีให้กับเรานะครับเราควรจะศึกษากรณีตัวอย่างที่ไหนครับอาจารย์ครับอยากให้อาจารย์ให้ตัวอย่างกับเราว่าเราควรจะไปดูตัวอย่างที่ดีของเว็บ approach ของอาจารย์ที่ไหนครับกรณีตัวอย่างไหนครับ
โอเคขอบคุณค่ะรมฎอนมีคำถามจากแชทอาจารย์ปอจะอ่านเร็วๆดีไหมคะอาจจะรวบนะคะไม่ต้องอ่านแบบคำต่อคำดีไหมคะ
ได้ค่ะโอเคค่ะคำถามนะคะจากทั้งทาง Zoom แล้วก็ Facebook นะคะจากอาจารย์ศรีดาค่ะ Do you agree to make the roadmap for peace negotiation to end up conflict คำถามที่2จากคุณรันและปิดรันนะคะจะแก้ปัญหาจากฝ่ายรัฐในการไม่ยอมรับกลุ่มองค์กรภาคประชาสังคมในพื้นที่ได้อย่างไรด้วยวิธีใดคำถามจากคุณพรเพ็ญนะคะจะสร้าง collective empathy ได้อย่างไรเมื่อสื่อมวลชนในพื้นที่และประเทศไทยถูกปิดกั้นอย่างหนักค่ะ
Okay, I think that's all. A lot of good questions. Yeah, Professor Lederach, please.
Yes, thank you. These questions may not easily be answered in a few minutes. So I'll try my best to touch on a couple of them, and then maybe we could have some follow-up if some of you would like at some point. Yeah, I think so. Part of what on the first question, I believe it was Sinat, I'm not sure I got the full name. Part of the reason for a web approach in understanding the interactive dynamics is to focus less on finding who is to blame and focus more on what are the repeated patterns that seem to create the same purpose and outcome in the end. And those dynamics, I think, help us address some of this question, both maybe perhaps in reference to the first and the latter question, but by understanding the repeated dynamics, how a set of things keeps coming back to produce the same purpose, even though people in leadership and issues have shifted, really opens up a greater possibility of moving away from blame and toward common purpose of shifting the aspects of the system that are creating harm. So the bigger picture in part is to understand how and why it's functional for conflict to continue, why it is a benefit, what are the things that are being offered, and what are the patterns that are a part of that that can be looked at more concretely as particular ways that may be points of leverage within the system that could be shifted. So it's a little hard to go into that in great detail at this point, but one of the things that typically happens is that the web approach and understanding those interdependencies and that wider system help bring our focus less on blame and more on repeated pattern and dynamics. And that for me has a very significant way. Much of the innovations that happened at local levels that when I saw that creativity was precisely because people found new ways of going at the pattern, but did not do that on the basis of saying we have to get rid of X person or somebody is to blame. Those tended to be ways that did not open up new possibilities. So how to understand the dynamics that drive the system. Norbert was talking about drivers, which I think is a very good term, is actually quite helpful in moving away from frameworks that don't permit us to get out of the repeated box. And you know, it would take a good bit more time. I've not been in the south of Thailand for quite some time, so I'm not sure I'm well versed to be able to speak to it. So my guess would be that some of what was brought up in terms of Anna's question may also be relevant there, in that patterns of exclusion are quite common. Dynamics of exclusion are quite common. And when exclusion happens, what you know is emergent is that we are not attending to the full complexity of what people are both experiencing and what they aspire to. And in particular, I would fully agree with your overarching assessment, Anna, that the two populations that are often most affected, I think what you call the double burden, the two populations that are most affected are often the ones that are most excluded, and that's women and youth. Youth are often drawn into conflict, are often used at the front edge of mobilization, but they rarely are brought forward into significant components of being the shapers of what is coming into their future. And I think we have to do a lot more on that. Women, we know from almost every empirical study that has been done, bear a great burden of the harm of conflict, but are least represented at almost every aspect of the middle to higher levels of formal peace negotiations. That's the empirical evidence. There was a point at which I think about 10 years ago, it's improved now because there has been a much greater emphasis on engaging more women directly in processes of learning and representation in negotiation. This probably has shifted, but when I was writing at the period of the moral imagination, it literally was something like you could count the number of women who were a part of high-level peace negotiations across 30 conflicts on two hands. Literally, there were almost no women who were functioning at the highest level of mediation or at the highest level of on the negotiation panels. And of the exception, the Philippines was probably the most significant in reference to that. But that does not go to the deeper point that you're making, which is, I think, that the web approach very much moves in the direction of fully understanding where and how better quality of relationships are stitched. So one of the aspects of understanding a web is not just to understand what's missing, but to also understand what we sometimes call in sociology the positive deviance. Positive deviance is the unexpected goodness, a quality of something contributive. And what we very commonly find, and this is true across microeconomics, it's true across development, it's true across peace building, that where there is a greater participation of women, there is a greater attendance to the quality of life in the communities that experience what's happening. And where that can be replicated in I'm going to use a strange word here, but where it can be replicated in a fractal approach. Fractal means that every level replicates the other level. If you want, you live in Thailand, so you have many plants that have a fractal quality. The fern, the very quiet fern is the best of those plants. It's the plant where the leaf, the smallest part of the leaf, looks like the same as the largest part of the whole plant. Every part replicates the quality of other parts of the living organism. And the question I think that you're raising, Anna, is how do we acknowledge and build the capacity for the goodness of what stitches our relationships is often at the core of how everything from families to communities to whole nations should be thinking about their functioning. And where we have the goodness excluded, we will miss the stitching that lasts over time that will be needed. And so I think the core question of inclusion is not just about some formula. It is about the fundamental understanding of what holds together, the glue that holds together good relationships. And that we have much work to do to better improve and bring that forward. Final little piece on examples. I didn't quite catch the person who asked that, so I apologize. Maybe I see was it Ramadan Panjor? I can't remember who asked that question. I apologize for not getting all the names.
Yes, Ramadan.
Yeah, okay, Ramadan. Thank you for that. Since time is very short, let me make mention of an organization that you could find on the web that would be an example of this in a very interesting way. It's based in Nepal, and they work often in remote rural regions of Nepal. They're called the Natural Resource Conflict Transformation Center. Natural Resource Conflict Transformation Center, NRCTC. And their whole model is based on the notion of spider groups, where the response to natural resource conflicts, land, access to water, and use of forests, all which create deep and often very violent conflicts in a country that has a very significant caste structure of exclusion, has been coming at those approaches by using a model of circulating and developing a web approach to handle sometimes 15 and 20-year-old deep-rooted violent conflicts. And they've done more, I think now it's almost approximating 200 different situations within the country that they have found a way to transform. So if you wanted to actually, they have on their website, a lot of it is in Nepali, but there is a whole portion in English. And they outline some of the basic parameters and ideas that they use for how they approach it. They do not use external mediators. So it's a process of facilitation by way of small groups of people who are embedded within the conflict situation, who move around, opening up the doors and the conversations until the whole of the communities affected have a way to gather that is then facilitated by a composite group of people who are from those communities themselves. And it's an interesting one because while they work locally, they're now starting to have a national ripple. And so it's also a new and different way of thinking about the connection between the local and the national in reference to what are very significant conflicts within the country. Hapungkap to all of you, thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm sorry I probably took too long in responding to some of this, and I hope to see you again someday in Thailand.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Lederach. Last, we will have a concluding remarks by Assistant Professor Dr. Sisompop Chitpiromsi, the Director of Center for Conflict Study and Cultural Diversity. Professor Ajahn Sisompop, please.
Thank you. On behalf of IPS, Institute for Peace Studies, we are pleased to have Professor Lederach with us today. And I think this lecture is very eye-opening for us. And we have learned many issues and theoretical concepts that could be applied to our society. I think talking about web and spiders, I have my own experience. Just last night here in the office in Pattani, I saw a small spider just little moving around between a tree and bush in front of my office, and then circle on and on and on. And in 1 hour, less than 1 hour, it is a web. It's beautiful, really beautiful. You can see from this picture background. So it's like my vision, you know, my vision. My friend here said that this is a kind of superstitious for me because I see the vision before you say it. So this is interesting, really amazing. So this and we understand that things happen here in the deep south of Thailand. Connection, relationships, people have perseverance to find out solution for the conflict here. We know that peace process, according to your lecture and your books, needs to have a strong infrastructure and social space. And this is involved relationships, building relationships, practices, process oriented, and and we need many actors to come together, help each other, and making understanding, mutual understanding, to build peace and conflict resolutions. So the challenge for Thailand now is how to bring in a genuine societal space or social space to practice and to transform social subjectivities. You talk about the subjectivity, social subjectivities have to be changed for the peace building, and we are facing tremendous difficulties here in Thailand, in the Deep South, based on the current regime that are not quite open for participation, not quite liberal regime. This is a challenge, and these challenges are to be solved through perseverance. We got inspiration from your lecture. It may take a long time to do, but we hope that we can do it based on the insight that you shared to us today. So I have no more to say, but just thanks Dr. Lederach to be with us today, and thanks U.S. Embassy in Bangkok to support this project, and thanks our audiences. And we hope to have a good lecture like this in the future. We will invite more international resource person to share idea, to bring in a new knowledge about peace and peace building for the benefits of Thai people and Thai society. So thank you.
ขอบคุณค่ะอาจารย์ศรีสมภพนะคะ for สำหรับการกล่าวปิดนะคะ We are very, very grateful for Professor Lederach for being very generous with his time to share his thought and his view with us tonight. This event is extraordinary in my view, and I think IPS will have an opportunity to welcome Professor Lederach again, either virtually or physically in Thailand or Southern Thailand. As an institution located in or near the conflict zone, we are very proud to be able to provide a platform to bring in people from various backgrounds to come together and learn more about peace process. Last, I would like to thank various people who has worked very hard behind the scene, the IPS team, to make this seminar tonight possible. อาจารย์ธรรมศาสตร์ขึ้นชื่อนะคะ อันนี้ทั้งทางทีมงานของสหรัฐอเมริกานะคะ the people from the U.S. Embassy แล้วก็ล่ามขอบคุณล่ามนะคะคุณอีฟนะคะแล้วก็ทีมงานของทาง IPS นะคะคุณอาจารย์ปอธรรมศาสตร์คุณเกตวดีคุณนิวดีอิมรอนฟาตนะสุฮดาแล้วนะคะขอบคุณมากๆนะคะสำหรับที่ทำให้งานวันนี้เกิดขึ้นได้นะคะ There are very many food for thought tonight. Last one thing I have to tell the audience. ขอให้ช่วยทำแบบประเมินนะคะหลังจากนี้นะคะจะมีการแสดงแบบประเมินนะคะอันนี้ก็กดQR code ได้เลยนะคะแล้วก็ช่วยรบกวนช่วยทำแบบประเมินให้กับเราด้วยนะคะLast, there are many food for thought for tonight for the audience, and I think that our audience will go back tonight, thinking more deeply about spider and spider web approach, and how they can use this approach to improve their work to build peace in the Deep South, and how they can deepen the sense of collective empathy and unite the effort to push forward the peace process in Southern Thailand. So thank you very much, and everyone, the audience who joined us tonight. Have a good night for people in Thailand, and have a good day for those in the States. ขอบคุณมากๆนะคะทุกท่านที่กรุณาเข้ามาร่วมรับฟังนะคะในวันนี้แล้วก็ขอให้ทุกท่านนอนหลับฝันดีนะคะแล้วก็ช่วยทำแบบเหมือนให้เราด้วยก่อนจะออกไปจากการสัมมนานี้นะคะสวัสดีค่ะ
สวัสดี